Sakemi Nishida, an assistant professor of disability studies and gender and women's studies. I am one of the co-organizers of this event series alongside my friends and colleagues, Patricia Macias Rojas and Ronak K. Kapadia at the University of Illinois at Chicago, UIC. To provide image description, I'm a Northeast Asian woman in her 30s with medium black hair, and in my back there is a whiteboard with posters saying vulnerability is resistance and nothing about us without us. To make our events accessible, live captioning is available. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you may click CC, live transcript, and the caption will appear on the Zoom screen. Or we are also providing stream text, which will stream the captions in a separate web windows. On stream text, you can change the size, color, and font of caption, as well as the color of the background. Please click Q and chat. So if you click a chat button in the bottom, there is a link for the stream text. Thank you, Tina Dillon, for providing the caption for today's event. And if there are any other access needs, please post them in the Q&A from the bottom. We will do our best to meet them. We also want to invite you to post questions in the Q&A feature throughout today's conversation. We set the last 25 minutes of this event to respond to your questions and comments posted on the Q&A. To start this event, we would like to acknowledge that the University of Illinois Chicago, where this event is hosted from, resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire people, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of pan-India movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lake regions at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the peoples of Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we, especially non-native peoples, must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence, and support indigenous communities' struggle for self-determination and sovereignty, which are very much in keeping with the themes of our series on reciprocity and redistribution. Today's event is sponsored by the 2021 Humanities Without Walls Seed Grant Initiative funded by Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We would also like to thank all of our co-sponsors at the University of Illinois Chicago, including the Institute for the Humanities, with special thanks to Linda Vavra and Mark Carnwell, as well as the Disability Cultural Center, and a special thanks to Margaret Fink, the Department of Disability and Human Development, the Institute for the Research on Race and Public Policy, and the Social Justice Initiative. Also, thank you, Lydia Howe, who is our amazing graduate assistant. Now, to begin our conversation, I will hand things over to today's moderator, Patricia Macias Rojas, a scholar activist for migrant justice and associate professor of sociology and Latin American and Latino studies here at the UIC.
Yes, this is Patricia. I have messy hair and glasses and a button-down shirt and a vest. I just want to thank you all for being here, for attending our event. And I wish that we could all be together in person. I just wanted to acknowledge that. I hope it doesn't impede your active participation with the Q&A. So I am going to briefly talk about our project as a whole and where this first conversation fits in before turning to our amazing panelists for our conversation. Okay. So beds and bed space are at the center of urgent political struggles and responses to multiple crises that have been intensified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Whether we're talking about beds in detention centers, psychiatric hospitals or nursing homes or prisons, or even the intimate spaces in our bedrooms. Our project is a way of bringing together artists, activists, and scholars from different communities into a critical dialogue about bed space and bed politics. So why beds? Our project is taking the object of the bed as an entry point. There's a way in which objects they have a way of conveying power. Objects can convey things that we don't ordinarily see as being about power. Sometimes objects convey power in more profound ways than even words do. Objects can convey things like emotion, experience, imagination, sometimes more than words can. And so bed politics is a way of mapping power relations. It allows us to map these bigger forces around capital or state violence, settler colonialism, white supremacy, and to show how these play out in the most intimate aspects of our everyday life. Now, the politics or bed politics, as we've been talking about them with my comrades Akemi and Ronak, have these three aspects which I want to briefly mention. There is, first and foremost, beds as a site of confinement and state violence. So in my work, I think a lot about beds as infrastructure that are driving detention and imprisonment. Bed capacity determines where funding will go, who will fill beds, and even the treatment and conditions that people will experience in hospitals, prisons, detention centers, residential institutions for disabled people, for instance. So this is one aspect then of bed politics. But there are also ways in which beds are actual sites of resistance. And here I want to lift up the filmmaker, poet, and activist Marlon Riggs, who did some of his most influential work from a bed. And I also want to remember Stacy Milburn, who protested California's discriminatory care rationing from a bed while on a ventilator, and others. And we were also thinking in our conversations about Emma Sulkowicz, who as a fourth year art student at Columbia University carried around a 50-pound mattress to represent the sexual assault she'd experienced and sexual assault in daily life. And so this is the second aspect of bed politics, beds as sites of resistance. But beds are also sites for dreaming and resetting and recharging and reimagining things. And this brings us to the third aspect of bed politics. Beds are places for rest. Beds are places for dreaming. Beds are places that are experiential and allow us to feel and imagine and rethink things. And as such, they're places for radical world making. So this series is centering beds and bed space activism as complex forms of resistance and visionary care that emerge from the intimate spaces of sick, disabled, detained, and imprisoned people. It builds on critical race, disability, feminist, queer, migrant, and carceral studies. When we were planning this, we envisioned 3 conversations as a series that build on each other. And so our first conversation will involve critical analyses of beds as sites of confinement. That's our event today. The next conversation in June will introduce us to radical and relational care that builds on themes of reciprocity and mutual interdependence. And the last one, which we're scheduling in September, will bring together artists and activists who are thinking about beds as sites of collective and creative dreaming and other forms of world making and radical redistribution. So our hope is that this series will contribute to new understandings of how frontline communities and allies are organizing to expose, survive, and resist multiple pandemics, from COVID-19 to inequality and poverty, state violence, and white supremacy. So for our first conversation, we've invited 3 amazing panelists that I have the honor of introducing. I'll go in the order that they appear in the flyer. So Beth Ritchie, Professor Beth Ritchie, is affiliated with our Black Studies department here at UIC and is the head of the Department of Critical Criminology, Law, and Justice here at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and is a founding member of INCITE, the Women of Color Against Violence. Many of you know her first and foremost as a feminist abolitionist whose work has centered women's experiences of violence and incarceration. Professor Ritchie's earlier work, Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation, analyzes important linkages between the contemporary anti-violence movement and mass incarceration. And we have some links that are being dropped with more information. I'm just doing abbreviated bios now. Lydia Brown is an advocate, educator, and attorney addressing state and interpersonal violence targeting disabled people living at the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, faith, language, and nation. Lydia is policy counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology and works on digital discrimination and disability, and is also policy director at the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. They are the founding director of the Fund for Community Reparations for Autistic People of Color's Interdependence, Survival, and Empowerment. Also, we're dropping info, more extensive info on Lydia. Silky Shaw is the executive director of the Detention Watch Network, a national coalition building power to abolish immigrant detention in the US. Silky has worked as an organizer on issues related to immigrant detention, mass incarceration, and racial and migrant justice for over 15 years. In her time at Detention Watch Network, she's been an exceptional leader in the immigrant rights movement and has been involved in campaigns around bed quotas and the expansion of immigrant jails. Prior to joining the Detention Watch Network, Silky also worked for the news program Democracy Now! In New York. Again, we're dropping more extensive info. So now we can turn to our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for being here, and we'll start our conversation. Okay, so I'll start with the first question. Is everyone okay? Should we get started? Okay, just checking in. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so here's the first question to start us off. So in the current moment we're in, we're seeing that some people are crammed into beds, like in overcrowded prisons, or forced into beds, like in psychiatric hospitals, while others are denied access to them, you know, like such as hospitals or even in detention centers where kids are sort of piled onto floors with foil blankets. Can each of you take around 5 minutes to talk about your political or intellectual work as it relates to the concept of bed space and or confinement? I thought perhaps we could start with you, Bev, or we can take volunteers. I'm going by the order in the flyers, but is that okay with everyone?
It's okay with me, unless Lydia or Silky would like to start. Well, first, thank you so much. This is an incredible discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Indeed, I'm in Chicago, on the stolen land. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Black woman with brown skin, short hair. I'm wearing glasses and a black top, and I'm sitting in my office that has a turquoise wall behind me. There's several artistic representations of Black femmes on the wall. And interestingly, in the corner of my office, which you can't really see, is a daybed. And for the purposes of this discussion, I want to start with the daybed. And thinking about it being in the office that I work from for home, where I teach and write and think and try to strategize new campaigns and cause trouble, develop interventions. The daybed sits sort of as the background to my work. And I didn't realize it until I was invited to be part of this discussion that I never sit on or lay on the daybed. And I sort of feel like it's almost a witness to the discussions about mass criminalization and the buildup of a prison nation that literally captures people in cages. Sometimes there's a bed, sometimes there isn't. And it sort of represents this place that absorbs even the pain that I sometimes write about when I'm talking about Black women and trans people compelled to crime. And it also holds the dreams that you talked about, Patricia, of abolition, of freedom, of Black justice, of queer justice. And so for me, the fact that I have a daybed, you know, I never even knew that that was a thing, but I have a daybed that I don't retreat to, is part of what informs sort of my politic around this. I don't approach it and read the amazing new books or even novels that people are writing. I feel like I can't lay down yet, if you will, because we still have so much work to do. Knees are still on necks, and we just can't rest until there's freedom. And so the daybed for me became a metaphor thinking about what to say about my work. It's a place that we can't yet access until the danger, repression, confinement, and pain are gone. And yet it does also, as you suggest, represent possible freedom and rest and respite and dreams. So my orientation to my work as a Black queer academic who's over 60, parenting an adolescent girl, a femme, sociologist, anti-violence activist, is the orientation of abolition feminism. And I do my work as an abolition feminist at the intersection of the buildup of a violent, oppressive prison nation and attempts to end the tyranny of patriarchal gender violence, mass criminalization and gender-based violence that happens both at the individual and also the state level. And when thinking about those two places, beds or bed space is kind of the contradictory notion of safety and confinement, comfort and pain, rest and resistance. I think abolition feminism allows us to think about those contradictions in important ways. I just will say quickly, for me, there are 8 ideas about abolition feminism that are linked to bed activism that define what I do in this space and in the world and explain why I don't yet rest on my daybed. Day or night. Don't rest on my daybed. So abolition feminism for me is a political practice that assumes that a different world is possible. That's the dream part. And it's not just possible like in a dreamy sense, but it's like seriously possible if we put our hearts and minds and money and relationships toward ending the things that are dangerous and end lives. And it assumes that things don't have to be the way they are now. So the second thing that abolition feminism says to me is that, yes, we have to get rid of the danger. We have to get rid of the trouble, but not make the trouble better. Like not put beds on the floor of a detention center so children aren't sleeping on the floor, they're sleeping on a bed, but in the same cell. We have to shut them down. We have to defund. We have to interrupt the flow into institutions, not make more space, but make less space. We have to stop the abuse. So the third thing is that when we replace the trouble with the things that we want to make whole, we have to make sure that the way we do it reflects a politic of reciprocity and mutual aid, and that it's about growing and changing, accessible gardens and co-ops, learning centers, healthy food, all of those things that dignify life and repair, but not make a little bit better, but really change the reality for people. Fourth, what we do, that change has to be determined by those people are most affected. Nothing about us without us, right? Fifth, we need to make sure that we provide for the reality that even as we're building, that there still will be harm and danger. And we need to respond to that, believing that people can change. No one's the worst thing they've ever done. As abolition feminists, we believe that there aren't sort of monsters there creating nightmares, but in fact, they're people who need to be redirected to help us build a different kind of world, and not put in the carceral spaces of the bed. There are big campaigns, but also we have to be doing everyday work. People have been doing abolition for a long time, and we need to keep doing it every day. And we need to learn as much from what we lose as what we gain. So as an abolition feminist, I think about sort of the fact that I can't rest yet on the day bed, but the bed has to be part of what my vision of change is. And part of that, I think, comes from thinking about how at the nexus of violence, gender-based violence, and mass criminalization and detention and incarceration is the sort of image of a bed can be a safe place that you get restored from, and it can be a place that takes your dreams away. And the challenge is how to build so that we have the bed of freedom and not the bed of confinement. And for me, abolition feminism, as I just sort of ran through how I think of it, for me, abolition feminism gives us some answers.
Thank you so much for starting us off in such an electric way. Who would like to go next? Lydia, since I'm going by the order in the flyer, unless I hear otherwise. Is that okay, Silky? Lydia? Okay, awesome.
This is Lydia. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a youngish East Asian person with short black hair and glasses. Today I'm wearing a shirt that says, "Choosing to love is a revolutionary act." It has a picture of bell hooks and a quote that says, "The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination." I'm sitting in a room that just has 2 windows with blinds behind me. When I think about what bed politics means in my practice as an organizer for disability justice, for liberation, for abolition, I think very similarly to the way that Beth talked about. The bed is both a site of criminalization, of domination, of control, of containment, and the bed is a space for the possibility of rest, of rejuvenation, of liberation. For disabled people, the bed is a space both where we often experience the most intimate and intense violence. The violence of medical violence and abuse, violence from our own family members, our parents, our siblings, our caregivers, our intimate partners, the violence of institutionalization and large-scale residential institutions for disabled people in psychiatric hospitals, in penal institutions, jails, prisons, and other immigrant detention prisons, the ways in which disabled people, especially Black, Brown, Native, Asian, and mixed race disabled people, the ways in which queer and trans disabled people at the margins of the margins in so many different ways have always been targeted for surveillance, for criminalization, for pathologization, for mechanisms of control, because of the intertwined beliefs and values of ableism, of white supremacy, the ways that systems of domination and oppression are always deeply interlinked and rely upon values of determining not just which people are valuable and worthy and desirable, but which people are expendable and disposable, which people deserve to be held with care in society, and which people instead deserve to be met only with punishment and violence, which people ought to be allowed to exist in society, and which people ought to be removed from society with justifications given varyingly, both for that being for that person's own good, quote unquote, and justifications as being for the good of society. I think about the ways in which disabled people, as people from many marginalized communities often are painted simultaneously as sexually dangerous, hypersexual predators, as threats, especially to the perceived and presumed sexual innocence of whiteness and of ableness, and simultaneously how disabled people, especially multiply marginalized disabled people, are deliberately and intentionally desexualized, presumed to lack even the ability to exercise sexual agency and autonomy, presumed to be, for a lifetime, infantile and childlike, innocent in a way that is nonetheless still dehumanizing, and how those realities exist at the same time, leading both to the confinement of disabled people for our own protection, from the assumption that anyone with whom we might engage in any sexual act with is automatically a predator, because no normal person would ever have desire for a disabled person, and confined for the protection of others, in particular the ways in which NIMBYism responds to proposals to build group homes for developmentally disabled people. There is always an element of sexual fear of the belief that a group home of developmentally disabled adults will be unsafe for children, with the implication being that developmentally disabled adults are unchecked sexual predators, or at the very least, incapable of understanding sexuality, and so will engage in inappropriate sexual behaviors at a bare minimum. And in all of those ways, these conversations elide the question of how violent such confinement or incarceration actually is. Most people who talk about disability who do not come from a disability justice perspective do not understand that carcerality moves across systems and spaces, physical as well as metaphorical. That carcerality shows up both in the physical spaces that we construct, the systems and the processes that we construct and maintain and seek to preserve, and the values with which we approach our relationships with one another in our communities. The project of abolition cannot be complete without disability justice. And the work of disability justice is necessarily abolitionist, intersectional, and liberatory. Because disability justice helps us understand that all of our body minds are valuable, all of our body minds are worthy. There is no wrong way for people's body minds to exist or to take up space. And therefore, for us to be in right relationship with one another and within our communities requires us to practice justice in a way that centers care and compassion and accountability at the same time. And that is the work of abolition and of transformative justice. So when I think about the bed, I think of the bed as a place both where disabled people experience incredible violence. And I think of the bed as a space for us to begin rethinking what our relationship to care is, what our relationship to our work is. I share very much the sentiment that Beth was sharing just a few minutes ago, and that in my work as an organizer, I often find that we don't rest. We don't take time to stop or to sleep. And we both, even if we remind other people, you need to rest, you need to take a break, you deserve to have people take care of you, we never internalize that and apply that to ourselves because we make ourselves feel guilty, and we are enabled in feeling guilty if we take even a 5-minute pause from doing our organizing work under the belief that if we don't do it, nobody will, and that if we fail to do it, then we are somehow failing the movement. In reality, the movement is failing us by teaching us that our body minds deserve to be destroyed and that we deserve to be subjected to the same extractive, exploitative, capitalist politics that destroy all of our capacity, not just to work, but to be in relationship and to build relationship with each other. Through not giving ourselves the space to actually make use of whether it is the daybed that you have in the room where you are, or the couch that's on the other side of the room here, or the opportunity to actually listen to each other when other organizers and comrades remind us that we deserve to receive care. Care only happens in community. And that's the last thing that I'll say about the bed. That the bed is not a place just of isolation where we might be alone, but the bed is also a place for community. The bed is a place for us to gather together. The bed is a place for us to share literal intimacy, not just sexual, but could be physical or emotional intimacy. Can be a place where we sit and talk late into the night. Can be a place where we hug one another. We've been deprived of human touch. Can be a place where we learn how to set expectations and boundaries around consent for all types of touch and engagement. Can be a place where we connect while lying there on the phone or on the computer or on FaceTime with people that we love who are distant from us. Can be a place for intimacy and connection and not just a place of isolation. So how can the bed in that position too open up conversation for care as a community, collective, interdependent process and not as an individualized one as white colonizing and capitalist mythologies will teach us?
Thank you so much for that powerful interventions. Silky?
Hi, everyone. This is Silky. I'm a South Asian person in my late 30s, and I'm sitting in an office. I'm wearing a green top, and I'm sitting in an office. I have kind of longish black hair, and I am in Bellingham, Washington, which is on the land of the Coast Salish people, and specifically the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, and specifically the Lummi and the Nooksack. And I'm really incredibly honored to be here with all of you today and just really taking in what Beth and Lydia shared. As, you know, when I was thinking about this talk, and a lot of times when I give talks, it's, you know, okay, here's the history of detention, and this is what it looks like, and these are the things, and it's like, well, what actually is going on here? And so much of how we talk about beds is that isolationist space. I don't actually I haven't actually created any space to think about the other. So I'm just want to name that, and really grateful. So in terms of immigration detention, which is where my expertise lies, and understanding lies, I think when we think about this iteration of detention and detention beds, it really started in the early 80s as Black migrants, specifically from Haiti and Cuba, were arriving to Florida, and the first detention site was sort of solidified, the Chrome Detention Center in Florida. And we started to see this desire to have more beds for immigration detention. And so, you know, a lot of things were happening in that moment. You had the Cold War, you had the rise of mass incarceration in the US, the war on drugs. And then as we go further and further, the growth of the detention system and, you know, trade policy plus 9/11, you get to this state where now so much of the conversation around detention is about the number of beds we have and who's in those beds, and so much of it is about beds as housing, you know. So the conversation is, well, these immigrants are arriving, and whether they are adults or children, or family units together, we need these spaces for housing them because they might not have anywhere else to go. When in fact, the whole purpose of the bed, of the space, is to facilitate deportation, to facilitate people being, you know, expelled, banished from the U.S. And not necessarily, you know, I think the frame is, well, they're there to be in compliance with their immigration case. And, you know, those sort of questions around, well, you know, can they do this from home, et cetera? But that's so much about, we need to ensure these individuals are deported. In addition, the bed is a deterrence strategy. So, and I don't like to talk, I'm not interested in myth busting, because I think often in the immigration context, myth busting lends itself to affirming really, really bad policies. But I think in the context of deterrence, you know, the idea here is, well, and Obama said this actually in 2014 when they came back to this mass family detention policy where they held children and their parents together in detention beds in Texas, and in Pennsylvania. And Obama was like, we're doing this because we want to send a message that people shouldn't come. And that's essentially what's happening right now as well. And so the one sort of technical, just to say, I think so much of immigration detention is this idea again of housing or a space for vetting and processing people, when in fact it's a misnomer. Jails are used, prisons are used for immigration detention. That's what it is. It's incarceration, it's confinement. They're secure settings. This is true for adults and for children, where we are now also, where we have seen and continue to see the expansion of secure facilities for children. And again, this idea, well, you know, I remember talking to a friend who was like, well, they need the mattresses. We have to get them the mattresses. And I was like, that's beside the point. It's about ending these facilities and like, what's our vision for what we want to happen. And I do want to mention something sort of specific in how it relates to our work at Detention Watch Network, which is a national coalition, again, trying to end the use of immigration detention. And, you know, we started in the 90s when Clinton really completely changed the paradigm on immigration in law, and Congress changed the paradigm on immigration to say, we are going to, you know, target more and more people for mandatory detention. And more we saw the expansion of immigration detention. And then post 9/11, a ton of money funneled in. And then we started to see in congressional language, we want 27,000 beds. We want 30,000 beds. You started to see this actual framing of the beds as being key. And then in 2009, Senator Robert Byrd, and his last name is Byrd, who is a senator from West Virginia, a Democrat, put into the appropriations bill, and this goes back to this funding question that, you know, has come to light even more and more about how much money goes into this, put into the language of the appropriations bill that we shall maintain no less than 33,400 beds for immigration detention. And this was a tactic to ensure that we were enforcing our immigration law. So the idea was that the bed became a place to ensure that deportations were continuing, that we were going to have some space to make this happen. And beyond that, and what we sort of dubbed it the bed quota, and actually it was written out of law in 2017. But again, you know, today Biden's budget came out and we don't have a number, and we're really curious what that number is going to be, because currently there's about 14,000 people incarcerated in immigration detention, when the height of it was 55,000 just a couple years ago. And that was largely because the border has been completely shut down. And because of the pandemic, we've seen a lot of individuals be deported, but not enforcement operations to bring more people in. And so, and people are coming in and people are being released, but we're at a really low number. But then Congress continues, the US government continues to pay for this, because there's also within these contracts guaranteed minimums, which we call local lockup quotas, that say, you know, here in Washington State, in Tacoma, there's a facility that is about 1,500 beds and 1,100, and has an 1,181 guaranteed minimum. So ICE is essentially paying for all those beds when there's 200 people currently detained there right now. And there's a lot of incentive tied up in that. We can get into that, but just to say, there's this thing also with the beds where it's like, okay, you have, you know, in Congress, this stipulation of how many, and then within the contracts, well, you have to pay for this much, and, you know, why pay for these beds if you're not going to use them? So much about how immigration detention works is actually about the beds themselves and these spaces, and how, you know, even now in the conversations we're having, there's a lot of people who are nervous about ending detention because that's going to, you know, stipulate how many people seeking asylum could come in. And it's like, well, why is that the question? No, let's accept individuals, give them resources, but not put them in inhumane settings. And I think, again, this idea of housing becomes really confused in this context. And so I think, yeah, I'll leave it there. I mean, there's so much more to say about that, but the bed, you know, I think is actually, I think we've struggled with the idea of beds because it takes away from the experience and the individuals and the people who are incarcerated, but it's central to the questions that we're negotiating and what we're trying to push back against.
So now I hope you see why we were so excited to have the three of you in conversation. I mean, we invited you because, you know, we're super excited about the cutting edge intersectional work that you're all doing. And we wanted to stage this conversation that brings together abolition, feminism, migrant justice, critical disability justice. And so in some ways, like you've prefigured in your comments kind of where we're going with our conversation series. And what we had envisioned for this one was almost like a power analysis of kind of where we're at and what we want to move away from. So, you know, you mentioned the overlapping themes of confinement, of violence, of carcerality. And I could hear kind of these overlaps and these logics and practices that cut across these spaces. And so we thought it could be interesting to think about, or to talk across movements, and to think about, you know, where you see like points of convergence, and divergence across these different spaces that you all work across, and possibly even what kinds of coalitions could be possible when we're talking about, if we try to center bed space. I should say that, already in the way that you all are talking, it just invites us a different way into the same conversations we've been having, as a movement people or activists. So to repeat the question, where do you see potential points of convergence or divergence or possible coalitions when we focus on bed space? And you could interpret that around however you want, or around campaigns, or if you want to get into an actual power analysis of where you're working. But we're just trying to open up that space for you all to speak to each other. So who would like to go first? Should we go in reverse, or do you want to volunteer, or should we go back to Beth? Beth, do you feel okay?
Yeah.
Starting us off? Okay, awesome.
Yeah, that was really powerful to hear, the themes that both Lydia and Silky brought up, because I think, part of where it all meets is in what I and others who identify as abolition feminists call a prison nation, and especially the buildup of a prison nation. That's like the ways that carcerality as an ideology and as a practice spreads. And I think it's an interesting way to think about sort of the mundane question of bed space, which really does seem like kind of there's, you can focus on the numbers, and you can argue, I guess, for a compassionate response to more or less. But it's really how bed space becomes a driver of, for me, increased carcerality as opposed to increased opportunities for freedom. And that, I think, is true across the various movements that we've talked about. And so, the notion of a prison nation holds, for me, kind of conceptually, how we are invested both ideologically, morally, politically, in terms of policy, we're invested in divesting from communities with the most need, divesting of opportunities for care and services and migration movement opportunity, and instead we're invested in criminalization, either like capital C criminalization or small c, like turning problems into crimes. And if not overt crimes, at least the kind of need for removal and control and limiting movement. And, in terms of mass incarceration, it's, aggressive law enforcement for all kinds of things that are really about norm violating behaviors, things that challenge the status quo. And so we build more beds to protect people, and we come up with more and more reasons that we need to build more beds, and we need more beds that are further away from communities where people live, because that's where space is. We need to lock it down more securely so that the building itself that houses the beds is safer. So we have harsher conditions. People stay in those beds for longer periods of time, for less serious offenses. And so that's like the literal beds of prison and a prison nation. But it also is this kind of metaphorical idea, which is where I think the cross-movement work can happen. So here's where we talk about beds and space outside of the buildings, but really in like the schools or the health services or the hospitals or the daycare centers. And it's the metaphorical buildup of a prison nation that requires containment, and people to be responsible for kind of in a neoliberal sense, taking care of their own containment. Like you have to pay back your money for the space that you occupied when you were incarcerated by the state, right? It's all of these ways that people become responsible for their own bed when we created the condition that led them to be targeted by the structure that required the bed. And I think that's true whether it's we forced migration, or whether we constructed what an able body is like, or whether we criminalized sex work. So whatever the sort of place that this lands, it's, for me, the carceral ideology and practice where criminalization requires a space, that requires a bed, and then we say that people who were in that space, occupying that bed, are somehow responsible for maintaining it. And for me, it's kind of tearing all of that down, more than just decarceration, but really taking down the ideology that allows us to create the need for the bed and then make people responsible for kind of their own oppression within that bed. And, I think there's lots of places. I think Black feminist theory talks about some of this, and, disability justice, and, there's international struggle that we can learn something from. But separate from like the big places, Patricia, I think it's like how in the same small gathering we talk about what about this work is carceral. What kind of organizations do we need to form based, I'm going to argue, on abolition feminism that says the work that I do around prisons is clearly linked to the work that the other people on this panel do, obviously, because it's the same thing. It's the same bed. It's the same push toward removal instead of, creating life. So again, I think the notion of a building of a prison nation and what we're doing to tear it down across movements gives me, I think, the best opportunity to think about it.
Thank you so much for naming those deep logics that sometimes aren't visible, but that you've just kind of laid out in such a concrete way. Lydia, would you like to respond next?
Disability justice inherently requires coalition and community building. The 10 principles of disability justice, as outlined by Patricia Byrne, Aurora Levins Morales, and others. Byrne is B-E-R-N-E. Aurora Levins Morales. Levins is L-E-V-I-N-S. Those 10 principles include cross-community solidarity, cross-movement solidarity, as well as cross-disability solidarity. And the 10 principles of disability justice start even earlier than that with the principle of intersectionality. To do disability justice work in any way meaningfully, and I don't mean in the ways that a lot of wealth-privileged white people like to co-opt the language or term disability justice because they think it's trendy now. People who are actually doing disability justice work, largely BIPOC disabled people, queer and trans disabled people who are on the front lines, whose work is on the ground. Our work begins with intersectionality and requires cross-movement solidarity because disability exists in every space and in every community. And what many people don't understand as well is that because ableism is so intertwined with, rooted in, necessary for, and dependent upon every other system of domination and oppression, disability is actually more prevalent in every marginalized, minoritized, colonized, and oppressed community than it is in every analogously privileged and resourced community. Disability can be caused directly or exacerbated by racialized capitalism, by environmental racism, by deprivation, by incarceration, and family separation, and many other forms of violence and deprivation and extraction and exploitation that our communities are subjected to. And so when I think about what does it mean to build coalitions or to build bridges, or where do I see any divergences or linkages, I don't even know where to begin with that question. Because ableism is so endemic in every other form of oppression, and every other form of oppression is also rooted in ableism. When you look at carcerality and how it operates by designating certain people as fit for community, as fit for care, as fit for justice, and other people as unfit for those same things, fit instead for isolation, for deprivation, for harm, for erasure, for disappearance. Carcerality teaches us, whether at the macro level in how we societally designate certain spaces as for community and other spaces as spaces of isolation, segregation, control, containment, and management, that even in our individual interpersonal relationships, even in movement work, that the way that we approach one another and the way we approach our labor should also operate according to carceral principles and carceral practices. And for me, the project of abolition, rooted in and informed by disability justice politic and visioning, and the work of disability justice, which must necessarily be abolitionist, requires us to instead think through what care actually means. Care means offering each other ways to meet our needs, body-minded needs, our need for food, housing, emotional and physical safety as defined by ourselves, by our own communities. But care also means caring for each other and doing movement work, caring for each other's sustainability, which is another one of those 10 principles of disability justice, and doing care in the context of transformative justice and accountability practice. There's a lot of people mistake abolition as meaning the absence of consequences or the absence of accountability. A lot of people mistake abolition as meaning that there can never be acknowledgement of harm done, because to do so would in fact be to reenact carceral practices. But abolitionist practice doesn't require us to ignore harm. Rather, it requires us to name harm, to take ownership over the instances and the ways and the patterns in which any of us have caused or been complicit in harm. And it requires us at the community and collective level to engender the conditions to make that work possible. Recently, this came up in my communities and my work around the anthology that I was lead editor of that was published several years ago. We intended for this anthology to be the first ever collection entirely of autistic people of color, writing on autism and race. And over the last couple of years, and more recently in conversation with community members over the last 2 months, I learned that not only had I made the mistake of allowing us to publish a handful of white Ashkenazi Jewish people who were not people of color, and I had also enabled us to publish a piece that was authored by one of our co-editors that included comments that were racist in a number of different ways. And this was brought to our attention by community members who said, this was harmful, this was upsetting, this has made me feel distrustful and it made me feel betrayed, this was incredibly difficult for me to encounter. And we engaged in a lot of conversations privately with affected community members and with people who were involved in the creation of the project to think through what did we actually do and what would it take for us to do what we can to attempt to repair the harm we've already caused and to work on ourselves and with each other to reduce the likelihood that we would be able to cause that same harm again in the future. And ultimately, all of us collectively released a statement on behalf of the editor's team describing what happened, what we did, and what we're planning to do moving forward. And before we did that, there were a lot of conversations about what does it mean for us to release a public statement. Is saying something in public inherently performative? Is saying something in public a failed project? Is allowing a handful of people to say this was harmful to us and us saying, oh, okay, definitely that was bad then, engaging in a politic of disposability? And what we concluded was actually this was an act of trust and faith that people were willing to talk to us about the ways in which they were harmed by what we did, the ways that we harmed others with our choices. And in order for us to accept that gift of trust and to move forward in our work, we had no other option but to think through, what does it look like for us to own what we did, to take accountability for that, and to move our work forward in the service of broader projects of liberation, whether it is through this particular type of project or other types of projects. But we could only do that in the context of having built up community and participating in community that engendered the conditions of care necessary to disrupt carceral expectations of what it would look like either to ignore the harm done or to enact a response to harm that looks just like performative self-flagellation instead of actually just saying, we caused harm and we want to work on what happened so that this doesn't occur again. Because we wouldn't be true to our principles or our values of anti-oppression toward liberation if we failed or refused to engage in those conversations with our own community members. When I think about linkages and connections and coalition building, I think too about what kind of community spaces we are creating, engendering, and sustaining that enable the conditions necessary for us to support each other in taking accountability and ownership over harm we have caused. Because a future in which we've moved toward liberation doesn't mean there is no harm, but it does mean there's no state harm, there's no institutional harm, there's no systemic harm, and there's substantially reduced interpersonal harm, but there might still be some. And if we don't work now on practices for acknowledging, taking ownership of, and doing accountability work around harm that we ourselves cause or are complicit in, then how do we expect to build macro systems and processes within an abolitionist framework, within a framework where our conversation around beds is not rooted in conversations about violence? How do we move toward that future where there is no such thing as carcerality anymore, if we can't even acknowledge or own what harm and responding to harm looks like from a transformative justice approach, from an abolitionist approach in our own relationships and in our own communities?
Thank you so much. I mean, it's just so, I really appreciate sort of seeing the transition from, Beth talking about, our ideology and logics, and you, Linda, are talking about kind of the practices in our movements. I do want to create space for Silky to join the conversation before we move to Q&A. Silky, is that okay? Okay.
Yeah. I think that when I think about this question of convergence, I actually think there's just no scenario where we are going to get to a better world if we don't. There's no scenario where, the very acute moments I can think about in recent years are very specifically in Louisiana and New Jersey, where you saw some shifts in towards decarceration. So, bail reform in New Jersey led to the emptying of jail beds. And in Louisiana, justice reinvestment led to thousands of, the highest rate of incarceration in the world, but thousands of empty prison beds. And these are because we live not just in a carceral society, but also in a deeply carceral economy. These places were now struggling and figuring out, okay, how are we going to make funds? And the federal government was there to say, and Trump was ready to expand. And so we got a huge expansion of immigration detention, especially in Louisiana, where there aren't lawyers to support people, where the isolation is actually the thing that's going to push people to voluntarily deport themselves, et cetera. So I think that, if we continue to work in silos, if we continue to work in a vacuum, it's going to harm all our communities. That's just the reality. We have to be really asking those questions about accountability. The other thing I just wanted to name in this conversation as we think about beds and moving forward and what sort of this could mean and the harm that's done, I think in so many ways I'm an abolitionist. I believe no incarceration should exist. When I think about the context for unaccompanied children, it's a complicated one. It's not an easy one because you have, I mean, in some ways it's actually easy because it's like if you actually allow kids to come with their parents or, you know, an aunt or an uncle or somebody or, you know, another family member, caregiver, then you reduce the number of unaccompanied kids, and that's a thing that needs to happen. But those individuals who are, and what is the setting, I think there's this, you know, the mass scale, like things at scale are inherently a problem. And when we think about, you know, what a setting could look like, a home-like setting with, you know, a bed and space that people can be cared for and et cetera. It doesn't happen in a place that's 3,000 people. Like that just doesn't work that way. And so, I think that's something we should think about more. And on top of that, I mean, I think there's this big idea of like, we need to do so much to, you know, help these, individuals, and what's like the programs and what are these nonprofits who can get large contracts to help people seeking asylum. And it's, well, actually, I think instead, again, rather than at scale, like, you know, let's think about the last year and this sort of conversation around mutual aid. What does it mean for us to create communities where we can have those resources that, you know, what somebody might need in South Texas is really different than somebody who is in, you know, New York City. Like it, you know, those conditions are different. What does it mean in the places that we happen to live and be? And I think that should be a conversation as well as we think about beds and what care can be, and thinking about the individual needs, but the community needs as well. And yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us in the conversations around mutual aid to really consider that.
Yeah, I'm getting chills with this conversation because I really think you're setting or creating a space to rethink things. And I do want to, if it's okay, to open up a space. I think there are some questions in the Q&A. We'd like to invite people to post their questions. Also, I don't know, are we putting emails in case people want to share their bed stories? No, not necessary. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to my comrade, Ronak. And if that's okay, we'll just open it up to questions to in the conversation.
Thank you, Patricia. And hi, everyone. I'm Ronak Kapadia. I'm a mid-30s South Asian person with brown skin and a beard and wearing a bright pink shirt. And I have an Angela Davis poster from the 70s in my background with stacks and stacks of books. We have gotten some questions in the Q&A, and I want to encourage folks to put praise and affirmation and comments and questions in the Q&A. I will just try to distill a couple of these and then maybe pose one of the questions, a longer question. The first thing that Tom Olin and Aisha Mohammed are asking is if we could talk more about the kind of grassroots organizers who are making the sorts of connections across disability justice, migrant justice, and abolition feminism. Who are some people that you want to lift up or name in this space? There's been so much genius on display already in this conversation, but it's good, I think, perhaps for folks to have a sense of the kinds of collectives and organizations that are just already thinking in this way. And part of what's been so revitalizing in hearing you talk is about putting bed space as the kind of conceptual frame through which you're thinking about all the kind of organizing and scholarship and criticism that you've offered us. Aisha Mohammed is asking if the language of beds in hospitals and prisons and immigrant detention facilities, how does that shape how people treat this issue? Is bed a euphemism for imprisonment? And I think this speaks, Silky, to some of what you were talking about beds as being a kind of the sort of stand-in for how we talk about the carceral regime and detention. And should we move away from that term? Are there other alternative or intentional terms to use? So thinking about the kind of language question here. Liat Ben Moshe, our colleague here at UIC, is asking a longer question that I want us to maybe start with. She's saying that she appreciates the genealogy that Silky began on how the concept of bed space has been lodged into legislation in the US in the 1980s. And she's asking, can other speakers build on that and how collectives rise or maybe rose to respond to these moments? And Lydia is saying that she's thinking of Arrested Justice, Beth's project, and how the anti-violence movement leading up to the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act in the 1990s, increased the prisonation, and how Insight was founded, for example. Same, she says, with the genealogy of nursing homes and psychiatric institutionalization. So maybe a little bit of sense of how these shifts in state violence and gender racial capitalism produce openings or ruptures for the kinds of abolitionist and anti-carceral work that what became efflorescent in these particular moments. Beth or Lydia, do you have a thought about this? I'll start with Beth because we've named Arrested Justice here, and maybe you can connect part of what Silky's saying.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Liat, for that question. I think you kind of answered it a little bit in the question, but for me, and I was thinking about this when Silky was talking too, beds in this context become like a unit of service. It's what's counted as the helping transaction. That's a one-way, paternalistic, conservative, containing, kind of decentering, alienating, like that's what the bed is. And if you're in an abusive relationship, you get on a waiting list for a bed, and the bed gets sort of represented as your exit from the relationship, as if that's freedom, right? And when you're a private prison corporation, you sign a contract with a state or a county, and they guarantee you money to put people in that bed. The service there is to keep the community safe. So you fill up the bed, and if you're going to you get paid whether the bed is filled or not, right? So you might as well fill the bed. In an institution for people with a disability, you get put in the bed, and the bed space becomes like the measure of like how successful you are, how many people have used the service. So there's a way that beds become part of a neoliberal project of not-for-profit service that is has a tempering effect, a chilling effect, an erasure kind of effect on possibilities of liberation. And it occurred to me earlier, I think by something you said, Lydia, that what if we found a way to do political education with everybody who's in a bed, especially a bed against their will? Or even if they choose to be in that bed, it's the only place they can survive. And if we think about all the bedded people, now I'm maybe taking the metaphor too far here, but if you think about the bedded people who could be, who have an analysis of what happened, who know what the deal is, why they're in that bed, and organize, I think we're kind of cross movement talking about a lot of people who could contribute to a large liberation project and some bed resistance, So it's kind of a long answer, but I think the question about bed equaling unit of service and how that feeds a conservative carceral agenda is, for me, kind of at the root of your question.
Lydia, can I ask you to respond as well? Or thought about this?
Something that's been on my mind a lot over the last several years is the way in which rhetoric in response to mass shootings and other acts of gun violence is very much rooted in ableism and racism, even and especially from people who claim to be violence prevention advocates, perhaps in the same vein to what you mentioned, Leah, when mentioning advocacy around VAWA, that ultimately expanded carcerality, expanded carceral places, expanded the realm of what can be criminalized, and expanded resources and tools of carcerality as a means of at least putatively addressing violence. Similarly, for many years now, even going back to 1999 in the Columbine shooting, the typical response to gun violence, especially from people who claim to want to prevent gun violence, is to advocate for enacting and expanding carcerality, especially as applies to people with psychosocial disabilities and to developmentally disabled people. And you can hear this when people will say, well, everybody should support gun control and universal background checks because we don't want violent people or mentally ill people from getting access to guns. Now, when we pick apart that rhetoric, we might understand maybe a bit more readily that violent is usually code for Black and brown people. And that a criminal background check literally relies upon the existing criminal legal system to be able to identify correctly all of the people who are actually potentially violent in a way that we might not want someone to be further enabled to do worse violent things, and that it will not include anyone else inadvertently. And we know that that's wrong on both counts. Large numbers of people, especially wealth-classed, white, non-disabled people, get away with violence all the time, especially and including white people who act as agents of the state, literally get away with violence constantly. And if the people who are targeted by violence are marginalized in any way because they do sex work, because they are homeless, because they are BIPOC, because they are queer or trans, because they are refugee, because they are of a lower caste or lower class, then the likelihood that the person who perpetrates that violence would be held to account, even by the definition of account within the criminal legal system, plummets. And we also know that huge numbers of people who are marginalized for all these different reasons, but especially Black and brown disabled people, are targeted by the criminal legal system even in the absence of actual harmful conduct, or based on false accusations of harmful conduct. So saying, let's rely on universal background checks to prevent the wrong people from having guns isn't actually a useful proxy at all, let alone an accurate mapping of people who we may want to be less enabled with access to weapons to do worse violent acts. But then the other half of that, well, we don't want people who are mentally ill to have access to guns. To the vast majority of people, they would look at me when I say that and say, well, what's wrong with that? Why do you want someone who's crazy to have a gun? Crazy people do violent things like commit mass shootings. Crazy people are the ones that make other people uncomfortable. And besides, even if it's not just the mass shootings, what about people with depression who are going to kill themselves if they get access to a gun? Because statistics do show that someone who is experiencing suicidality is more likely to attempt an act of suicide if they have easy access to a gun. But an anti-ableist response to those rhetorics that claim to be addressing the problem of gun violence, whether at scale or smaller instances that are not large numbers of people being shot, that might be someone shoots 2 people or 1 person, or someone uses a gun in an attempt at suicide, I push back on that, number one, because to lump in suicidality with acts of violence is itself violent. And number two, to claim that because somebody is psych disabled, that automatically means that we ought not to be trusted with something that apparently a lot of people in this country assume that most other people should just be trusted with just because, which is a separate conversation as to what actually useful regulations around guns would look like. This rhetoric is not it, because this rhetoric automatically presumes that due to ableism, disabled people, especially psych-disabled people, are necessarily criminal, suspect, and dangerous. Presumptions that are even worse for disabled people who are multiply marginalized. And when I was in high school, I was falsely accused of planning a school shooting. And that was absolutely gendered, racialized, and ableist. That accusation didn't exist in a vacuum. The belief that other people could hold that I am the type of person who ought to be profiled as likely to engage in a mass shooting, likely to commit a mass shooting, is very much influenced by race, by gender, and by disability, and cannot be separated from that. So what makes us believe that in this nation that is obsessed with carcerality, of mass criminalization and mass incarceration, that is profoundly white supremacist and profoundly ableist, that's saying, let's use universal background checks that rely on the criminal legal system and determinations of mental defectiveness, which is literally what federal gun law actually says. The quote is, persons who have been adjudicated as a mental defective. That's the actual language on the books today in 2021, are the persons who are prohibited from accessing guns. So is this the mechanism that we want to use to reduce gun violence? Because number one, it's not working. And number two, the largest perpetrators of gun violence are the police and the military in the service of state violence and imperialism.
well said all across the board, Lydia. And I mean, you're just teasing out all of the ways in which liberal reforms of the criminal legal system only expand the carceral state. And that's true in every movement that we are assembling here and bringing together. And, you know, it's 3:24. We just have a couple minutes. And Silky, I want to hear from you as we're about to close. But, you know, can you say a bit about, like, what does it mean to center people who are multiply minoritized at the center, not only of our analysis, but of the kind of complex coalitional building, organizing? This is coming out in the Q&A, but it's certainly on all of our minds, right? It's like, how do we center people most impacted by these harms, who have the most genius and sort of political analysis through which to dismantle the carceral state and the prison nation? Silky, do you have a thought about that in closing? That's a heavy question, I know.
I'll just be quick, because Beth and Lydia, this has been an amazing space to be in with both of you, and would love to hear what you say. That question about sort of grassroots groups, I mean, there's so many, and I'll encourage folks, if they're interested in getting involved in this work. We have a lot of groups that we work with across the country who are trying to think about these intersections, especially in the context of, great, we ended an ICE contract, this facility still exists, what are we doing to, abolish this county jail, or et cetera. But Survived and Punished is an obvious group that I would just flag as, sort of looking at a lot of these intersections and really actively trying to support individuals who are survivors of violence and have been imprisoned. And, recently, Gabby Solano, for instance, was incarcerated for such a long time. Their sentence was commuted, but then was immediately transferred to ICE once released. And just the harm that does, I think, across systems. And so, again, why we need to bring all this together. So I'll just leave it there, since I know we're out of time, but flagging that.
Thank you so much, Silky, and thank you for lifting up Survived and Punished. I'm going to ask my colleague Akemi to come back on video and offer us a closing here. We're running out of time. Lydia Brown has dropped a whole heap of amazing organizations and collectives to name in the chat. And Akemi, I'm going to let you take it away in conclusion now. Thank you all.
Hi. So thank you so much again for the amazing panelists for these great conversations, and all the people who joined this conversation series, Reciprocal Politics of Bed Space Activism from Confinement to Radical Care. This is a conversational series, and 2 more conversations are coming up with different speakers. The next conversation is in June, which will introduce us to radical care circulating among marginalized communities from beds. The last one is in September, which will take us to collective and creative dreams of other world making, rooted in the spaces of the beds. We will circulate a flyer to organizations, email listservs, and social networking sites as we did this fall event. So please keep checking wherever you found info about this event, and we'll circulate the info there again. Again, thank you so much for joining, and have a good Friday.